Hi students, this is Dr. Spellman recording my first video lecture on Robert Nozick's The Entitlement Theory of Justice. So we're going to see how this goes. Hopefully it will go smoothly. Alright, so today we're going to talk about Robert Nozick's The Entitlement Theory of Justice. If you'll sort of remember where we're at, we've talked a little bit about Rawls's theory, and we know that Rawls is a political liberal. Robert Nozick is a libertarian, and so he's got a little bit different theory of justice, one that's not going to be as focused on making sure that the least well-off are as well-off as possible. On Nozick's view, he thinks what's important is just that we act justly in all our transfers, and if that results in wide gaps in wealth, then so be it. All right, so here we go. When we read Nozick's paper, right, which you've done or you're going to do, we find that his thesis is for what he calls the entitlement theory of justice. What that theory says is that individuals are entitled to their holdings, their property, whatever they have, provided that they acquired it in accordance with the principles of justice and acquisition, the principle of justice and transfer, and the principle of the rectification of injustice. So those are the sort of three central principles for Nozick. If everyone is entitled to their holdings in accordance with these principles, right? If what everyone has was acquired in accordance with the principles of justice and acquisition, justice and transfer, and the rectification of injustice, then the entire distribution of holdings is just. So then we want to ask ourselves, well, why does Nozick think this? Like, why should we accept his view rather than Rawls' view? And here Nozick's going to talk about a few different kinds of principles of justice. On the one hand, he talks about current time slice principles, or what he calls end state principles. And then on the other hand, there are these pattern principles of justice. He rejects both of those in favor of a historical principle of justice. And we're going to talk a little bit about what current time slice, pattern principles, and historical principles will look like. The first thing we're going to do is look at his argument against current time slice, or what he also calls end state principles of justice. This argument depends on the claim that some people Nozick's argument, right, depends on the claim that some people deserve more or less than others, and that like what they deserve is important, not just sort of how much people have at a particular time and whether or not they're sort of balanced in the right sort of way. So let's look at an example. Okay, never mind. Let's look at his argument. So Nozick's argument against current time slice principle of justice goes like this. To know whether someone who's wealthy or locked up in prison or whatever state they're in is justified in being in that state, we need to know whether that person deserves to be in that state. So to know whether someone who's wealthy is justified in being wealthy, we need to know whether that person deserves to be wealthy. And to know whether someone deserves to be wealthy or in prison, etc., we need to know more than just how wealth is distributed or who's in prison, or whatever the case is. And that's the end state, sort of like the situation at a time. So to know whether someone who's wealthy is justified in being wealthy, we need to know how we got there. We need to know more than the current wealth distribution. So here's an example. We looked at one of these briefly in class the other day, and you'll see that things are a little bit different than before. So I'm going to get my cursor here. We've got people, person 1, person 2, person 3. We've got some worlds, world 1, world 2, and world 3. In world 1, person 1 has 12 units of whatever the social goods are. Maybe happiness is part of that, maybe income is part of that, whatever the thing that we're measuring is. Person 2's got 10 of those units, person 3's got 9. Oh shoot, go back. Sorry about that. Okay, so if we total all those up, there are sort of 31 units of social goods in that first world. World 2, person 1 has 4, person 2 has 22, person 3 has 13, for a total of 39. And in world 3, person 1 has 20, person 2 has 8, person 3 has 8, for a total of 36. And so we ask sort of which world is the best world, or which world is the one that's just? And for the utilitarian, remember, right, everyone's interest matters equally. And so what we do to figure out whether or not a world's just is we just sort of figure out, well, which one's got the most social goods? And in this case, that's world number 2, right? So the one with 39. That's the utilitarian view. Rawls' view, right, is that the world is just when the people who are the least well off are as well off as possible. So the goal in Rawls' mind is to have that low number be as high as it possibly can. And if we look at the worlds, we see that the lowest number in world 1 is 9, the lowest number in world 2 is 4, and the lowest number in world 3 is 8. And so for Rawls, he's going to say, well, world number 1 is best because it has the highest maximum principle applies there. So that's Rawls. Now, what someone like Nozick could say is that, well, how do we know that world 1 or world 2 is really better than world 3? It seems like if we want to know whether or not the distribution of social goods is just, we need to know more than just like what the situation is. We need to know some facts about the history. So let's think about world number 2 here, the world that the utilitarians say is best. Nozick might say, and Eric Mack has said this in commenting on Nozick's view, he says, it's possible that world 2 came about because person number 1 here, who has 4, is being enslaved by person number 2, and maybe person number 3 is kind of like the slave master or something. So person 2 owns the plantation, person 3 is like slave master or something like that, and then person number 1 is enslaved. And the thought is, well, okay, that might be the best in terms of total utility, but that's not just. What about world number 1? He says, something here could be, so I've got this, in this world, maybe person 1 is enslaved 7 days a week, right? In world number 1, how did we get here, right? Nozick thinks that's important. So maybe here, person 1 is still enslaved, but he's only enslaved like 1 day a week or something like that. So the thought is person 2 is still the owner, person 3 is still the slave master, but then person 1 is only enslaved 1 day a week. And so he's way better off than he was in world 2, but still not as well off as he would be if he was never enslaved. And so imagine world 3, right, is one in which person 1 is not enslaved at all. And he ends up with 20 units of the social goods. Person 2 has 8, and person 3 has 8 as well. And those are things, even though this isn't as good on Rawls's view or the utilitarian view, it's still the best one if we tell the story that way. If that's in fact how things played out, then Nozick thinks that's the most just world, right? The world in which person number 1 is not enslaved. So that's a pretty powerful argument, I think, in favor of Nozick's view. But we're going to get another argument here, an argument, the Wilt Chamberlain argument. This is a picture of Wilt Chamberlain, the basketball player. And before we dive into Wilt Chamberlain, I think it's important maybe just to go back here briefly and to see, like, okay, what the point of this example is that the end state principles where we can just look at how people are at a time and decide which world's just. Nozick thinks those fail. We really need that background information. So once I gave you that background information, right, then you thought, well, world 3 is actually the better one. And that's why Nozick thinks his argument is going to end up being the best one. Okay, so let's look at Wilt Chamberlain example. So suppose Wilt Chamberlain is greatly in demand. He's a great basketball player. All the teams want him, and because he draws more people, greater crowds. Let's say he signs the following sort of contract. In each home game, 25 cents from the price of each ticket of admission goes to Wilt Chamberlain. The season starts, and people cheerfully attend the games. They buy their tickets. Each time they drop a separate 25 cents of their admission price into a special box that has his name on it. They're excited about seeing him play. It's worth the total admission price to those people. So imagine people really like seeing Wilt Chamberlain play basketball, and they're willing to pay a little bit extra to watch him play. Let's suppose that in one season, there are 1 million people who attend those games, and Wilt Chamberlain, as a result, ends up with $250,000, much more than the average income and larger than anyone else has. Not only maybe on his team, but the owners, anyone. Is Wilt Chamberlain entitled to that income? That's the question that Nozick wants to pose. And so there's, what do you think? Is Wilt Chamberlain entitled to that $250,000? One thing you can always do here on these questions, I encourage you to pause, think about it a little bit, sort through your views, and then we'll sort of see if those match what the author intended to say. So if you want to pause, you can pause now, but I'll just move on. So here's how the argument goes. Assume at some time, D1, there's a just distribution of goods. And then what we get is Wilt Chamberlain signs his contract. He's going to play. Maybe it's for the Cleveland Cavaliers. That'd be great. The Cavs could really use him. And as a result, he makes all this money. He signed this really great contract where he gets 25 cents of every ticket. And so he ends up with more money than anyone else. That's a future time, right? And the way we got to that time, the just distribution in the first case, and we ended up at distribution number 2, were just according to justice and the principles of transfer. So the transfer was just, the owners agreed to it, Wilt Chamberlain agreed to it, the people who were buying the tickets agreed to it, everyone was fine with it. And Nozick thinks that if you sort of start with a just distribution, where nobody's got any money they've got unjustly, and then you have fair exchanges, then you'll arrive at a concluding point or a distribution that is fair as well. So if we've got a just distribution at D1, we've got a just distribution at D2. All right, so if we think about the argument then, the thought is Chamberlain's entitled to the $250,000. And if that's true, then it seems like Rawls's difference principle must be false. Because what did the difference principle say? The difference principle said that inequality is justified only if it benefits the least well-off members of society. But here we've got inequality that's not clearly benefiting the least well-off members of society. I don't know who exactly is attending the basketball games, right? Let's say, but presumably it's not the poorest of the poor. And so the inequality and the benefits that Wilt Chamberlain's getting isn't really benefiting those who are the least well-off. And so if Wilt Chamberlain's entitled to the $250,000, then it seems like Rawls's principle is false. And so that's the conclusion. Rawls's difference principle must be false. Now the question we want to ask ourselves is whether or not that's a good argument. How's Rawls going to object to it? What can he say? And I think there are a number of different things that Rawls can say. I think there's a way in which premise 1, he could try and object to that one, right? Say, no, Wilt Chamberlain's not entitled to the $250,000. It's true that sort of everything was just here, but even so, the principles of justice and transfer and acquisition, those aren't really the right principles. That's not really the best society. It's not one we would agree to behind the veil of ignorance. There might also be ways to reject premise 2, to say like, well, Rawls's difference principle can get us the conclusion that Wilt Chamberlain is entitled to the $250,000. So it's a little bit unclear how Rawls is going to object to this argument, but let's explore some possibilities. First, premise one. So for Rawls, in a way, the question isn't whether Wilt Chamberlain acquired the wealth in accordance with the principles of justice and transfer. Instead, we want to ask, in the original position of equality behind the veil of ignorance, would we agree to a social structure that allows Wilt Chamberlain to earn so much more money than everyone else? Maybe we would, but maybe we wouldn't, right? The answer to the question is going to depend on whether agreeing to this structure that allows Wilt Chamberlain to earn so much more than everyone else is going to benefit the least well off. That's the question that Rawls thinks we'd be interested in. And I'm not really sure whether agreeing to that social structure would benefit the least well off, right? We've already suggested, maybe the poorest of the poor aren't really the people who are watching sports or benefiting from what Wilt Chamberlain's able to do. And so if behind the veil of ignorance we're really interested in that, I'm not sure we would agree to this social structure. Now, allowing someone like Wilt Chamberlain to make so much more than others, as I say here, right, it would definitely motivate people to play professional sports. But do those benefit the least well off? That's the question I've already raised. And if so, couldn't they produce the same benefit to the least well off without allowing athletes to earn so much more than everyone else? And I think this is an interesting point about how much value does Wilt Chamberlain really add to sports? Wouldn't it be just about as much fun to watch if Wilt Chamberlain wasn't playing basketball, for example? Now, don't get me wrong, I think Wilt Chamberlain's really a great player, and it's fun to watch great players like LeBron James or Michael Jordan, people like that. But I also think there's something nice about parity in the league. So when all the teams are on a relatively equal skill level, I think that can make games more fun to watch when they're more competitive. And so maybe, although Wilt Chamberlain is fun to watch, it might also be that the game is in general less fun to watch because he's dominating the other team all the time. And so I just don't think it's clear exactly how much of a benefit Wilt Chamberlain is really having on the well-being of everyone else. Another reason to think that maybe we wouldn't agree to the social structure that allows Wilt Chamberlain to earn so much money is that Wilt Chamberlain's talents are, in a large part, just a matter of luck, right? He's physically really lucky to be as tall as he is and as athletic as he is. And it seems unlikely that we're going to agree to a social structure on which luck has such a significant impact on one's income or wealth over one's lifetime. So remember, again, behind the veil of ignorance, we don't know if we're going to be Wilt Chamberlain or if we're going to be born with some physical deformity, for example, or disease that prohibits us from playing basketball. And so I don't think from behind the veil we want to give one group of people, basketball players or professional athletes, such massive amounts of money over what everyone else is earning. It seems like we're going to minimize the effects that luck has on the population. And so it seems unlikely that we're going to allow lucky people, physically gifted people like LeBron James or Michael Jordan, albeit they worked hard, I don't want to deny that. But I do want to say that it seems unlikely that we're going to allow them to make so much more money than others in their similar position. How's Nozick going to respond to these objections? Well, Nozick can grant that Wilt Chamberlain does not deserve so much more wealth than everyone else. Although Nozick thinks that desert is relevant to justice, though, he thinks there's more to justice than giving people what they deserve. So I think Nozick might say, yeah, I'm not saying that Wilt Chamberlain deserves to have all this additional money. I just think that desert's one sort of factor that we need to think about when we think about justice, but that there's more to justice ultimately than giving people what they deserve. And that is going to be something about autonomy, right? Respecting people's decisions. And this is why Nozick's view is a kind of Kantian view. Nozick, this leads us to Nozick's arguments against what he calls pattern principles of justice. So these are principles on which justice requires distributing social goods in accordance with moral merit, for example. So who's the morally best? We should give that person the most social goods. Needs, who needs it the most? We'll give that person the most social goods. The marginal product, the amount of social goods that they produce, or how much more they produce than they're receiving. So we might think whoever makes the most stuff deserves the most social goods. I think that, is pretty similar to maybe the kind of system that we're in. Or effort. Justice requires distributing social goods in accordance with whoever puts forth the most effort, or some combination of those. All those are what he calls pattern principles of justice, where justice is supposed to follow this feature like moral merit, or needs, or marginal product, or effort, or the combination, some sort of algorithm. But Nozick thinks these pattern principles of justice aren't quite right. So here's how that argument goes. If the government's going to distribute social goods in accordance with a pattern principle of justice, like the ones we just mentioned, right? The morally best, the person who needs it the most, the person who's producing the most, whatever it is, then it's going to have to constantly interfere with the distribution of social goods, even when that distribution arises from free exchanges. And that's what the Wilt Chamberlain example sort of shows, right? Is that if people are operating in this free market style system, then they're going to pay more to see Wilt Chamberlain or something like that. But if we're distributing social goods in accordance with who's the morally best person, then the government's going to have to take money away from Wilt Chamberlain because he's not morally the best, and they're going to have to give it to someone else who is morally better. And so that gets us premise 2. This seems wrong. It seems wrong for the government to be constantly taking away money from Wilt Chamberlain, who everybody's happy to pay this extra money to play basketball, so that we can redistribute those social goods. And this idea that the government sort of taxing people all the time to redistribute it in accordance with some other principle, that's morally problematic. And if that's true, right, then the conclusion is that it's wrong for the government to distribute the social goods in accordance with one of these pattern principles. If the government's going to do it, it's got to interfere with the distribution all the time, even if that distribution arose from free exchanges. The government shouldn't be interfering all the time, so it's wrong for the government to distribute social goods in accordance with one of those pattern principles. Now, as we finish, I want to consider a thought experiment. So here's the example, and I asked you something similar to this in the quiz. So imagine 2 people. One of those people, Sally, is born into difficult circumstances. Her parents are impoverished and they're mean. But Sally, however, is kind, and she works hard to overcome the disadvantages that she faces. She struggles to do so, but she ends up settling into an administrative position at Z Corp that makes $33,000 per year. As a result, she has difficulty accumulating any wealth because a lot of that money that she's making is going into housing and food and things like that. So Sally's overcome a great deal to get this good administrative position, but it's still not making her enough money to enable her to accumulate wealth. The other person we want to imagine is Sam. He's born into an easy situation, easy circumstances. His parents are wealthy and they're really kind. They raise him well. But nevertheless, Sam is lazy and mean. Nevertheless, he inherits ownership of Z Corp when his parents pass away. His net worth, because he inherits all this stuff from his parents, is $500 million, and he makes $10 million per year. Now, the question that I want to ask, right, is whether or not it's just for Sally to make $33,000 a year and have almost no net wealth, while Sam makes $1 million a year and has $500 million in wealth. What would Rawls say about that? What would Nozick say? Right? What do you think? And what I want to get at here, right, is that Sam maybe has acted perfectly in accordance with Nozick's principles of justice. Maybe his parents acquired their wealth justly, they transferred it justly, they didn't commit any injustices along the way. And same with Sally, right? Maybe her parents acquired their wealth justly, transferred it justly. I mean, in a sense, the thought is they weren't treated unjustly along the way. And so it seems like there's justice all along the process. And nevertheless, the outcome is a bit troubling, right? We think, I'm not sure that this society where Sam is making so much more than Sally is really a just one. And so that's just to cast a little bit of doubt on Nozick's view. Say, well, even though he does provide us with some powerful arguments, it potentially has some counterintuitive conclusions that it's forced to admit. But anyway, that's just a potential worry. And as I sort of ask you here, right, what do you think? Curious to see what you guys think about that. One implication of their views, obviously, Rawls and Nozick's views have significant implications for taxes in general. Should we tax the wealthy a lot? Right? Rawls is going to think that we should. Nozick's going to say, well, just because they're wealthy, that doesn't mean we should be taxing them all that much. And so there's a bit of a difference there. Here I'm talking about estate taxes, right? So when someone dies, they pass on their estate to their children, and there's this controversy over whether or not people should be able to pass all their wealth onto their kids. So the Hilton sort of wealthy hotel owners, we've got people like Paris Hilton, and some people think like, Paris Hilton doesn't deserve all this wealth. She hasn't really accomplished much. She doesn't work hard. She's not a great person. There's all sorts of reasons to think, well, maybe she doesn't really deserve to have so much more money than other people who have worked hard all their life. So that's another sort of implication there. All right, so we're finished with that lecture. I'd encourage you to watch the video lecture on how to complete homework number 4 and complete that assignment for Monday. We're going to try to meet synchronously at 12 noon on Monday just to sort of see how that works. Maybe I'll try and pair you up in groups and have you work through some homework problems together. All right, we'll see you then.